An ancient oak holds secrets meant only for those who listen. Elara, a young naturalist with a quiet spirit, presses her ear against its rough bark, her notebook open to a fresh page. She seeks the sleep stories whispered in the breeze, believing they hold a deeper code that could soothe the restless dreams of her entire village. But this quest risks revealing truths the woods have guarded for centuries. By the end of this journey, you will discover how to find a profound and natural peace, the kind that quietens even the most restless mind. I wonder where you are listening from right now and what the local time is there as we begin. What if the wind carried stories meant just for you, stories that could gently guide you into a deeper rest? Her pencil moved slowly across the page, tracing the deep grooves and ridges of the ancient bark. To any other eye, these were just the random scars of time and weather, but Elara's fingers felt a different story. They traced lines that curved and intersected with a strange sense of purpose. She was not just drawing a tree, she was attempting to copy a language, and then she saw it, a pattern so subtle it had been hiding in plain sight. A faint spiral, like a fern about to unfurl, repeating itself in miniature across a specific section of the trunk. It was not the work of insects or decay. It felt designed. A surge of quiet excitement warmed her, a confirmation that the whispers she sought were not just in the air, but etched into the wood itself. A sharp gust of wind, colder than the rest, sliced through the calm. It snatched the very page from her notebook, the one bearing the fresh sketch of the spiral. The paper danced wildly on the air, a white bird fleeing into the thicket. Her instinct was to chase it, to protect the only physical proof of her discovery. That was her nature, to document and preserve. But in that split second, a deeper knowing settled over her. Chasing the page would mean turning her back on the source of the message, breaking the fragile thread of attention she had just established. She let it go. The decision felt like a small earthquake within her, a fundamental shift from relying on records to trusting her own senses. The loss of the page was a real risk, a tangible piece of knowledge now carried away by the same force she was trying to understand. Yet, in releasing it, she felt a new connection to the woods, an intuitive bond that was more immediate than any sketch. It was a choice that set her on a far less certain path, one guided by feeling rather than fact. As the light softened into dusk, the character of the wind changed. The rustling leaves around her began to produce a new sound, no longer a chaotic whisper, but a low, melodic hum that seemed to resonate from the ground itself. The unfamiliar hum pulled her forward, deeper into the gathering shadows. Pushing aside a curtain of ferns, Elara froze. There, in a small clearing, a family of foxes tumbled and chased one another in a fluid, playful dance. But it was not random play. Their russet bodies wove through the ferns in perfect rhythm, a living current that shifted direction with each new gust of wind. A leap here, a sudden stop there. Every movement was a direct, physical response to the air's invisible push and pull. In that moment, her understanding of the code shattered and reformed. It was not just in the bark or the breeze. The fauna were part of it, their behavior a living annotation to the tree's silent language. Her research was no longer just about plants. It was about an entire speaking ecosystem. The lead fox, a larger vixen with a dark-tipped tail, suddenly stopped her play. Her head snapped up, and her sharp, intelligent eyes locked directly onto Elara's. The playful energy vanished, replaced by a tense, silent standoff. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Was this a warning, a command to turn back from secrets not meant for human eyes? Or was it an invitation, a test of her intentions? Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum in the quiet. Every instinct told her to stand her ground, to show she was not afraid, but a deeper wisdom whispered otherwise. This was not a territory to be claimed, but a conversation to be joined. Slowly, deliberately, Elara lowered herself to the soft earth. She curled her legs beneath her, making her body as small and non-threatening as possible. It was an act of submission, a silent signal of respect for the forest's true inhabitants. She averted her gaze, looking down at the moss between her feet, showing she posed no challenge. The tension in the air shifted, thinning from a threat into a cautious curiosity. This peaceful interaction was a profound revelation. It proved the entire ecosystem communicated as one single, sensitive entity. But that unity carried a grave warning. If one part was disturbed, the alarm would ripple through the whole. The Vixen watched her for a long moment more, then gave a soft, almost imperceptible chuff. She turned with elegant grace and trotted away, her brush leaving a faint, inviting path through the crushed undergrowth. The path through the ferns was a faint, winding line, a suggestion more than a trail. Trusting the Vixen's silent guidance meant ignoring every cautionary tale she had ever heard about this part of the forest. The air grew dense, the familiar sounds of birds and rustling creatures fading into an absolute hush. Stepping into the secluded grove felt like entering a different world. The light was muted, filtered through a dense canopy that allowed no direct sun, and the air itself was motionless, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient. The bark of the surrounding trees was not the familiar rough brown, but was instead coated in a silvery, luminous moss that seemed to absorb the dim light and glow with a soft, internal radiance. The silence was the most unnerving part. It was not peaceful, but thick and watchful, pressing in on her ears. For someone who listened to the wind for guidance, this utter absence of sound felt like a wall. A cold thread of doubt wound its way through her mind. Had she misread the fox signal? Was this not an invitation, but a boundary she was never meant to cross? The absence of the breeze, her primary translator, left her feeling deaf and utterly alone. The very codes she sought seemed to have retreated beyond her reach. Fighting the urge to turn back, Elara remembered the lesson of letting go. If she could not hear with her ears, she would have to listen with something else. She settled onto the cool, mossy ground, closed her eyes, and turned her attention inward. She focused on the steady rhythm of her own breathing, the slow inhale and exhale that was a tiny, personal win. As her mind quieted, the oppressive silence around her began to transform. It was not an emptiness, but a different kind of fullness. She became aware of a low, almost imperceptible vibration humming up through the earth, a resonance so deep it was felt more than heard. It was the sound of the grove itself, a frequency far below the rustle of leaves. This was the ultimate test of her faith. It asked her to believe in a language without words, a music without melody. Success would mean her intuitive path was true, that human perception could, with patience, align with the ancient pulse of the world. Failure would mean the codes were forever locked away, a secret belonging only to the trees and the wind. As this thought hung in the balance, a single, perfect leaf detached from a high branch. It did not fall randomly, but spun in a gentle, deliberate spiral, a miniature replica of the symbol she had seen on the oak. It landed, without a sound, directly in the center of her open palm. The leaf felt impossibly delicate in her palm, a tiny, perfect key. Her eyes, now adjusted to the grove's soft glow, traced the intricate lattice of veins spreading from its central stem. They were not random. The pattern was a near-perfect mirror of the spiral she had seen on the ancient oak, a miniature map rendered in delicate, branching lines. This was the confirmation she had been searching for. The code was not confined to one tree or one element. It was a chorus, a language spoken by the bark, echoed by the wind, and now written on a single leaf. But the triumph was fleeting. As she watched, the leaf's edges began to curl inward, the vibrant green fading to a brittle brown right before her eyes. The pattern, so clear moments ago, started to warp and shrink. A cold panic gripped her. This clue was not meant to last. It was a message delivered on a fragile, dissolving medium, and if she did not act immediately, its secret would be lost forever. Her hand moved on instinct, driven by a newfound urgency. She fumbled in her satchel for a piece of soft charcoal and a fresh page in her notebook. Laying the leaf flat on the paper, she gently rubbed the charcoal stick across its surface. The pressure had to be just right, enough to capture the delicate veins without crushing the leaf to dust. With each careful stroke, the map-like pattern transferred onto the page, a ghostly gray impression of the living code. It was an act of translation, of moving knowledge from the ephemeral world of the forest into the more permanent, though still fragile, world of human record. The successful rubbing was a small victory, a tangible piece of evidence she could hold. It bolstered her spirit, a surge of confidence that her intuitive path was correct. Yet, the crumbling leaf in her hand was a stark reminder of the stakes. The entire system of codes was transient, like a story told on a breath of wind. Learning it required not just observation, but speed and a deep respect for its fleeting nature. As this realization settled, a gentle breeze returned to the grove, its first whisper in what felt like an age. It rustled the pages of her open notebook, tugging softly at the corner of the leaf, rubbing as if asking to see what she had preserved. The breeze tugged at the paper in her hand, a persistent guide she could no longer ignore. Closing her eyes, Elara surrendered to its gentle pressure, letting it pull her forward step by cautious step. With vision gone, her other senses sharpened. She felt the subtle shifts in the air against her skin, a cool current leading her through the trees. It was a walk of pure faith, trusting an invisible hand to lead her where her own maps had failed. The path ended not at a tree or a thicket, but at the soft, musical sound of running water. Opening her eyes, she found a small, crystal-clear brook she had never known existed, its presence uncharted in any of her books. The relief of finding the stream was instantly shattered. The wind's constant whisper in the pines now battled with the water's cheerful, bubbling babble. Instead of a harmonious duet, the two sounds clashed, creating a jarring cacophony that scrambled her thoughts. The very codes she sought seemed to be arguing, their messages canceling each other out and threatening to fracture her hard-won focus. Overwhelm washed over her, a dizzying sense that the forest's language was too complex, its voices too many to ever understand. Fighting the panic, she knew she had to find a new center. Sinking to her knees on the damp bank, she plunged her hands into the brook. The shock of the cool water was an anchor, a stark, tangible reality cutting through the noise. She focused on the feel of the current flowing over her skin, its steady, relentless push. Slowly, she began to discern a rhythm, a pulse within the flow that was not so different from the breath of the wind. The water's journey over stone had its own melody, and as she listened not just with her ears, but with her whole being, she started to feel how the air's movement above the stream interacted with the water's path below. They were not in conflict, they were in conversation. This was the ultimate test, the synthesis of all the forest's voices. To hear the final code, she would need to listen to bark, breeze, and brook, not as separate languages, but as different instruments in a single, vast orchestra. The stakes of this understanding were immense, for failure meant the message would remain forever fragmented. It was then, as her perception widened to take in the whole scene, that her eyes fell to the stream bed. The stones lining the bottom were not scattered by chance. They were arranged in a deliberate, flowing pattern, their placement too symmetrical, too purposeful to be the random work of the current. The stones were not ordinary river rocks. Each smooth, flat surface held a carved symbol, a mark of clear intention. Without a second thought, Elara stepped into the cool, shallow water, the current tugging at her boots. She reached down, her fingers closing around the first stone. It was heavier than it looked, and as she lifted it, she saw the carving, a swirling line that echoed the spiral from the ancient oak. Her heart leaped. She turned over another and another. Every stone bore a unique mark, some like branching veins, others like the patterns of frost on a window pane. This was not a random collection. The brook bed was a library, and each stone was a page in a book written by the forest itself. But the water was a restless librarian. The current, which had felt so steady moments before, now seemed intent on its own work. It pushed against her legs, and each time she lifted a stone, the water rushed to fill the void, threatening to shift the surrounding stones and blur their sacred order. She had to work with a new kind of focus, a blend of speed and infinite care. Her movements became a delicate dance, bracing against the flow, while her hands gently prized each heavy page from its watery binding. She could not read them all there. The risk of the sequence being lost was too great. Wading back to the bank, she began to create a new order on the soft, damp earth. She placed the first stone, the one with the spiral, down carefully. Then she returned for the next, and the next, arranging them in a line that mirrored the sequence in which she had found them in the stream. This was no longer simple observation. This was an act of reconstruction. She was piecing together a story that the elements had deliberately scattered, moving from a passive listener to an active participant in the decoding. The weight of this new role settled upon her. A mistake here, placing one stone out of order, could create a completely false narrative. She was not just copying symbols anymore. She was interpreting their grammar, their syntax. As the line of stones grew longer on the bank, a pattern began to emerge. The symbols did not just repeat, they evolved, starting with simple forms and building into more complex, interconnected designs. Her eyes followed the sequence she had built, and a clear directionality emerged. The story the stones were telling did not end at the water's edge. The final symbols, the most intricate ones, all seemed to point unmistakably toward a shadowy cluster of willow trees, swaying gently further down the stream. The path was becoming clear, but the final chapter waded deep within those hanging branches. The willows stood like patient scribes, their long, trailing branches sweeping the earth. Elara moved closer, her breath catching as she saw the truth. The branches were not simply drooping, they were delicately, purposefully tracing lines into the soft soil. And the lines were unmistakable. They were the same symbols she had pulled from the stream, the spirals and branching veins now being redrawn by the trees themselves. The forest was not just holding a code, it was actively writing it, using wind and branch as pen and parchment. A surge of understanding washed over her, so profound it felt like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. The entire woodland was a single, conscious author. Then, without warning, a sharp gust of wind tore through the grove. It seized the willow branches, whipping them into a frantic, chaotic dance. The delicate patterns in the soil, the carefully inscribed stories, were scoured away in an instant, erased by the same force that had written them. The blank earth, where the symbols had been, felt like a loss, a page ripped from a book, just as she began to read. Her first impulse was frustration, a desperate wish to capture what was gone. But as she watched the wild flailing of the branches, a deeper lesson settled upon her. This was not destruction, it was part of the process. Some knowledge refused to be seized. It could only be received when it was offered. She lowered herself to the ground, folding her legs beneath her and resting her hands in her lap. This was the ultimate test of her new path. She would not chase, she would not demand, she would wait. The wind continued to gust, but she focused on the steady rhythm of her own breathing, allowing the frenzy around her to exist without resistance. She understood now that the sleep stories she sought were not static things to be collected. They were like the patterns in the soil, emerging only in conditions of calm. A restless mind, like a stormy wind, would only ever see a blur. True understanding required inner stillness to match the forest's quiet moments. Slowly, the gusting wind softened back into a gentle breeze. The willow branches settled, their tips once again descending to touch the earth with deliberate grace. Elara watched, her heart quiet, as the story began to rewrite itself. A single curved line appeared, then another, connecting and flowing into a new symbol. It was simpler than the others, yet carried a deep sense of peace. It depicted a gentle hill under a graceful crescent moon, a scene of such profound and simple tranquility that she felt her own shoulders relax just by looking at it. This was the first complete message, a direct transmission of the calm she had cultivated within herself. The code was finally beginning to reveal its true purpose. Her charcoal stick moved softly across the page, tracing the lines of the crescent moon over the gentle hill. As the symbol took shape on the paper, she did not just copy its form, she wrote down the feeling it carried. In the margins, her pencil added quiet field notes. The air smells of damp earth. After a long, quiet rain, she wrote, "The light here is the color of pearl." A deep stillness rests in this place, the kind that settles heavy on your eyelids. This was more than a drawing. It was the first true entry in a new kind of journal, a collection of quiet sleep stories, translated from the forest's own voice. But a flicker of doubt cooled her excitement. Was this feeling of safety her own invention? Was she, in her humanness, reducing a complex code to a simple bedtime tale? The symbol could hold layers of meaning about migration, paths, or seasonal changes that her desire for peace was causing her to completely overlook. The conflict was clear, a choice between intellectual suspicion and intuitive trust. She looked from the intricate symbol in the soil back to her own simple drawing, and she made her decision. She would trust the feeling, the sense of safety that had warmed her chest as the pattern formed was the message itself. This was not a puzzle to be solved with logic, but a feeling to be translated with the heart. The success of this first story, the tangible piece it created on the page, was a powerful fuel. It ignited a quiet determination to find more of these encoded lullabies, to build a library of calm for her village. As this resolve solidified, a single firefly drifted down from the willow branches. It circled her head once, then landed directly on the page, its tiny body pausing right over the drawn crescent moon. Its soft, rhythmic light pulsed over the symbol, as if giving a silent, living approval to her translation. The firefly's light pulsed one final time, then it was joined by another and another. Soon, a small constellation of them descended from the willow branches, drifting around her notebook. They did not land, but hovered just above the page, their tiny lanterns blinking on and off in a seemingly random dance. But Elara's trained eye quickly saw the order within the chaos. The lights were not random at all. They pulsed in small groups, their collective flashes highlighting first the curve of the crescent moon, then the slope of the hill, then the entire symbol as a whole. It was as if the forest had sent living proofreaders, their silent, blinking lights confirming that her translation was true. The symbol was indeed a marker of rest, a cartographer's sign for a place of deep peace. Yet the confirmation was a test in itself. The flickering pattern was intricate and fleeting, a visual code that changed faster than she could fully process. If she tried to sketch it, she would miss the next sequence. Her pencil was useless here. She needed a different way to capture the rhythm, a method as fluid as the light show itself. Closing her eyes to shut out the distraction of movement, she focused solely on the pulses of light she could see through her eyelids. Then, almost without thinking, she began to hum. It was a low, soft sound at first, a simple note that rose and fell with the most persistent rhythm she could discern. Her voice became a living recorder, matching the longer pauses and the quick, successive flashes. She was encoding the information not on paper, but in vibration, in melody. This auditory map felt more true to the moment than any drawing could be. The stakes of this strange duet were immense. The firefly's participation was an undeniable sign that the forest was not just allowing her to observe, but was actively collaborating with her. This help was a gift beyond anything she had imagined, a direct line to the wisdom she sought, but such a profound connection could not be one-sided. If the woods were giving her its secrets, it might one day ask for something in return, a responsibility she could not yet fathom. As if on cue, the humming chorus of lights ceased. The fireflies lifted from the page in a silent, shimmering cloud. Instead of returning to the trees, they drifted as one toward a nearby patch of earth. their collective glow settling over a cluster of mushrooms that pulsed with a faint, blue-green light of their own. The fireflies led her to a circle of mushrooms that glowed with the same soft, blue-green pulse. Stepping inside the ring felt like crossing a threshold into a room built of living light. The air hummed with a new energy, and as her eyes adjusted, she saw that the faint luminescence was not just on the ground. It climbed the trunks of the trees surrounding the circle, illuminating symbols carved into the bark that had been completely invisible by daylight. This was no accident of nature. She had found the forest's hidden library, its most sacred texts written in light that only appeared when the world was quietest. But the library was a challenging place to read. The mushroom light was not a steady glow. It breathed, brightening and dimming in a slow, hypnotic rhythm that made the symbols on the trees appear to swim and shift. Just as she would focus on a single line, the light would fade, plunging the mark back into shadow. The frustration was a tight knot in her chest. Worse was the creeping fear that her very presence was a disturbance. She moved with painstaking care, holding her breath, terrified that an errant footfall, or even her exhale, could extinguish the delicate fungi that held this entire story aloft. Her hand went to her pocket, her fingers closing around a smooth, cold shape. It was a piece of clear quartz she always carried, a lucky stone from a childhood stream. An idea sparked. She knelt slowly, holding the quartz just above the cap of the largest glowing mushroom. The crystal acted like a tiny lens, gathering the faint, pulsing light and focusing it into a brighter, steadier beam. She directed this small, crafted spotlight onto the nearest tree trunk. Instantly, the symbols there snapped into sharp, clear focus. She could study them without leaning in, without risking a single touch that might harm the grove. It was a perfect balance, using the forest's own gift to better see its message, without taking anything away. The symbols here were different. They were not single, peaceful images like the moon over the hill. They unfolded in long, vertical sequences, like sentences in a forgotten book. They told a longer story, one of seasons turning, of seeds sleeping deep in the earth before their slow journey toward the sun. This was the deeper code, the foundational myth of the woods themselves. The weight of the discovery was immense. She was not just learning a lullaby, she was being shown the origin of the forest's quiet strength. But with that knowledge came a profound responsibility. This place felt more sacred than any temple. Her intrusion had to be an act of reverence, a student quietly entering a hall of records, knowing that the privilege of entry required the utmost respect. To rush to be clumsy would be to shatter the trust the woods had slowly, carefully begun to place in her. The symbols on the trees wove a story far longer than any single image. Elara followed the sequence with her focused quartz beam, her movements slow and reverent. It began with a simple, closed circle, like a tiny stone. The next symbol showed a single crack appearing in its surface. Then a delicate, hair-thin line emerged from the crack, curling downward. This was not a simple lullaby. It was an epic, the entire life cycle of a seed, from its fall, from a great height to its stubborn, patient push through the dark soil toward a distant sun. Each symbol was a chapter, and she had to hold them all in her mind to understand the whole. The night air grew sharp and cold, biting through her thin cloak. A deep ache settled into her muscles from hours of kneeling and standing, her body a statue of concentration. A shiver ran through her, and for a moment, the quartz lens trembled in her hand, blurring the delicate line she was trying to memorize. The temptation to retreat was a warm, seductive thought. She imagined her small cottage, the glow of the hearth, a soft blanket, and a cup of tea. This comfort was a tangible thing, just a walk away. But the story on the tree was not finished. The seed was still deep underground, its journey incomplete. To leave now would be to abandon the tale in its most vulnerable moment, the dark night before the sprout. Pulling her cloak tighter, Elara settled back onto the cold ground, tucking her numb hands under her arms for warmth. She would not leave. The potential of this story, its intricate depiction of struggle and eventual emergence, felt more vital than any physical comfort. It was a narrative of profound resilience, the exact kind of deep comfort her village needed, a story that acknowledged darkness but always pointed toward growth. This was the cost of the code. The sleep stories were not free gifts. They demanded something in return, a measure of dedication, a willingness to share in a small part of the struggle they described. As she committed to staying, a strange thing happened. The cold did not vanish, but it ceased to be a distraction. Her focus narrowed to the pulse of the light and the flow of the symbols. Her charcoal moved more slowly now, capturing the final chapters, the unfurling of the first leaves, the reaching toward the light. The story was a masterpiece of quiet endurance. Just as she sketched the last symbol, a single blade of grass reaching for the sky, the first pale hint of dawn touched the eastern horizon. As if on a silent command, the soft glow of the mushrooms began to fade, their work for the night complete. The library was closing, its luminous texts receding back into the ordinary bark, leaving her in the gray pre-dawn light with a completed story and a body humming with exhaustion. The last symbol faded into the ordinary bark, just as the sun's first rays broke the horizon. Elara's hand flew across the page, her charcoal capturing the final lines in the growing gray light. She worked with a frantic energy, knowing that the window for this knowledge was closing as fast as the night itself. The final sketch was rough, but the story of the seed's journey was complete on the paper. A profound lesson settled in her tired bones. The forest's deepest truths were not always available. They were timed, like a flower that only opens after dusk. Some codes were written in light and could only be read in darkness. A sudden, sharp chirp from a waking bird made her flinch. It was followed by another, and then a chorus, the woods erupting into the busy, familiar sounds of day. After the profound silence of the glowing grove, the noise felt like an assault, a chaotic intrusion that shattered her hard-won focus. Her first instinct was to cover her ears, to try and hold on to the quiet a little longer. But she caught herself, her hands pausing in midair. Fighting the day would be like trying to stop the tide. Instead, she took a slow, deep breath, inhaling the cool morning air. She gently closed her notebook, the soft thud of the cover, a quiet promise to return. This acceptance was not a surrender, but a deeper kind of understanding. She was learning to move with the forest's rhythm, not against it. The need for rest was not a failure, but part of the process itself. Walking home through the now bright woods, the weight of the new story in her satchel felt both heavy and warm. It was a treasure, but a demanding one. Her research was no longer a simple hunt for answers. It was a dance with time itself, limited to the quiet hours when the world was asleep. This constraint was a new kind of challenge, one that required as much patience as it did perseverance. The old man's cottage smelled of wood smoke and loneliness. Elara found him in his chair by the cold hearth, his eyes weary and his hands restless. She did not promise him sleep, for that felt like a boast the forest would never make. Instead, she simply opened her notebook to the page with the seed's journey and began to speak in a low, steady voice. She described the small, hard stone of a seed falling through the endless dark, the immense patience of the crack that finally appeared, the slow, blind push through the heavy, nurturing soil. She wove in her quiet field notes the feeling of cool earth and the faint scent of rain. She had not even reached the part about the first green shoot breaking into the sunlight when she noticed his breathing had changed. It had deepened, slowing into the long, even rhythm of true rest. He was asleep. A powerful wave of relief and wonder washed over her, so strong it made her own eyes sting. It worked. The code was real, and it held a power she had only hoped for. But the warmth of that success was instantly followed by a cold, sharp pressure that settled in her chest. This was no longer just her private quest. That peaceful sleep was a result she could not unsee, a proof of concept that came with a weight of expectation. The vague hope of helping her village crystallized into a concrete duty. People would ask for this, they would need it, and she would be responsible for providing it. Closing her notebook softly, Elara made a silent vow to herself. She would continue, but she would never frame these stories as a cure. They were not medicine to be prescribed, but gifts to be offered, like a cup of water to a thirsty traveler. Their power lay in their gentleness, in the lack of demand. To promise a result would be to break the very trust the forest had taught her. The success of this first sharing transformed everything. Her solitary walks in the woods were now a community service, a gathering of quiet remedies for restless minds. And as she slipped out of the cottage, leaving the old man to his deep and healing rest, she knew that whispers of what had happened here would not stay contained within its four walls for long. The whispers traveled faster than footsteps on a forest path. A few days after the old man found his rest, a quiet knock came at Elara's door. A woman from the next village stood there, her face etched with a tired worry, holding the small hand of a boy who stared at the ground. The mother's voice was a low, urgent plea. She had heard of the sleep stories, and she begged Elara for one that could quiet her son's particular fear, the shadows that moved in his room at night and stole his peace. Elara's heart tightened. This was different. The story for the old man had been a general tale of patient growth, a gift offered without a specific promise. Now she was being asked to find a specific key for a specific lock, to decode a story not just for rest, but for safety. The codes had always come to her as they were, not as she might wish them to be. What if the forest had no story for a frightened child? To fail this boy, to see the hope fade from his mother's eyes, would feel like a profound betrayal of the trust she had begun to build. Looking down at the boy's anxious face, she knew she could not refuse. She agreed to try. This decision changed everything. When she walked into the woods that afternoon, she was no longer a passive listener waiting for a message. She carried a specific intention with her, a quiet, focused hum in her mind, safety from shadows. She moved through the familiar trees with a new purpose, her senses tuned not to the forest's general whisper, but for any clue that might speak directly to fear and the comfort that overcomes it. The sun was still high, and the woods were bright and loud with daytime life. She found herself searching for patterns in the interplay of light and dark, watching how a dense canopy created deep pools of shadow, and how a single sunbeam could pierce through to the forest floor, holding the darkness at bay. She was no longer just observing, she was actively questioning, asking the wind and the bark if they held a story for a scared child. This shift from receiver to seeker felt dangerous, like trying to force a conversation with a quiet friend. Would the forest close itself off if it felt her demands? The stakes of her quest had been raised immeasurably, and the weight of that hopeful boy's need walked silently beside her with every step she took. She revisited the ancient oak first, her palms flat against its familiar bark. This time, her mind was not an empty vessel waiting to be filled, but held a quiet, focused question, a plea for the boy's safety. Her eyes scanned the rough surface, and a knot she had passed a dozen times before suddenly looked different. Its gnarled, twisted shape no longer seemed random, but resembled a hand held open, fingers slightly curled as if to shield a small flame from the wind. The symbol of protection was there, clear as day. A thrill shot through her, but it was quickly followed by a cold trickle of doubt. Was this truly a message from the forest, or was her own desperate hope painting a familiar image onto the chaos of nature? She was terrified of inventing a comfort that did not exist, of building the boy's peace on a foundation of her own imagination. She had to know if the symbol was real. Pulling her notebook from her satchel, she flipped back through the earlier pages to the sketches she had made before she carried any specific requests. Her heart hammered as her eyes traced the drawings from her first days, when she was simply observing without a goal. There, in the margin of a page detailing lichen patterns, was a small, quick sketch of that very same knot. She had labeled it only as an interesting texture, and next to it, she had drawn the pattern of veins on a leaf that curled inward, cupping the space like a protective bowl. On another page, the stones from the stream that interlocked like a shield. The evidence was undeniable. The theme of protection was not her invention. It was a thread that had run through the forest's language all along, waiting for a question to make it visible. This was a revelation that changed everything. The codes were not just stories to be found. They were a library that could be queried. The forest responded to a sincere need by highlighting patterns that had always been present. The responsibility of this knowledge was immense, giving her a new and powerful tool, but one that demanded absolute honesty. If she approached with a selfish or careless intention, what false messages might she convince herself she saw? As this thought settled, a sudden movement broke her concentration. A rabbit burst from the undergrowth, its white tail a stark flash against the green and brown tapestry. It did not just run, it darted in a sharp, zigzag pattern directly in front of her, a living bolt of lightning aimed toward the willow grove. The purposeful urgency of its path felt less like chance and more like a summons. The rabbit's zigzag path was a line of pure urgency drawn across the forest floor. Elara followed without hesitation, her earlier doubts silenced by the creature's decisive movement. It led her not to another ancient tree or a hidden grove, but to a dense, wild hawthorn bush, its branches a tangled fortress of sharp, protective thorns. The rabbit paused for only a second, a flicker of brown and white, before vanishing into the undergrowth behind it, its messenger duty complete. Her eyes adjusted to the intricate weave of the branches, and there, nestled deep within the thorny heart of the bush, was a perfect bird's nest. It held 3 small, speckled eggs, a vision of absolute vulnerability, resting in a cradle of formidable defense. This was no abstract symbol carved in bark. It was a living, breathing lesson in sanctuary. A sudden, soft chirp from a branch above made her freeze. The mother bird had returned, a tiny wren with bright, anxious eyes fixed directly on her. Every instinct told Elara to step closer, to study the perfect construction of the nest, to see the exact pattern of thorns that shielded it, but to do so would be a violation. The bird's tense posture was a clear boundary, a silent plea for space. This was the test. The perfect story for the frightened boy was right here, but it could not be taken by force. It had to be received with the same respect the nest itself commanded. She slowly sank to the ground, putting herself below the bird's line of sight, making her body small and unthreatening. From this new, humble vantage point, she opened her notebook. Her charcoal did not attempt to capture every thorn or twig. Instead, she sketched the feeling of the scene. She drew the aggressive, jagged lines of the outer thorns, then softened her strokes to create a gentle, circular space at the center, a safe hollow where nothing could reach. She was drawing the concept of protection itself, the fierce love that creates a circle of safety against the shadows of the world. The success of this translation felt more significant than any before. She had not just found a story, she had witnessed its truth in the real world. This was the answer for the boy. The story would not deny the existence of shadows, of thorns in the dark. Instead, it would show how thorns themselves could be guardians, how the very things that seem sharp can create a space where fear cannot enter. She closed her notebook with a soft, final sound and began to back away, moving with infinite care so as not to startle the wren. She did not need to take anything more. The entire story, its beginning and its end, was held securely in her mind, a gift the forest had delivered with perfect, silent timing. Walking home, she felt the weight of the boy's hope, but it was no longer a heavy burden. It was a quiet purpose, and she carried the solution like a second, warmer heartbeat. The fire in her cottage hearth cast a warm, dancing light across the pages of her notebook. Elara sat at her small wooden table, the symbols of the shielding hand, the protective thorns, and the safe nest laid out before her like pieces of a puzzle. Her task was no longer to decode, but to weave. She had to take these raw, silent truths from the forest and spin them into a spoken story that could enter a child's mind and calm his racing heart. The pressure was a quiet hum in the room, as tangible as the heat from the flames. She knew the story had to be perfectly simple, a verbal blanket soft enough to smother fear without a single sharp edge. Her first attempts were clumsy, filled with too many words. She tried to describe the exact shape of the hawthorn thorns, the specific color of the wren's eggs, but it felt like a lecture, not a lullaby. The authentic voice of the forest was not in detailed descriptions. It was in feeling and rhythm. She scratched out the lines, the sound of the pencil loud in the quiet room. The conflict was clear, a tug of war between her desire for accuracy and the need for pure, soothing effect. She closed her eyes, letting the memory of the willow branches tracing their patterns in the soil return. Their movement had been slow, repetitive, and gentle. That was the key. Opening her eyes, she began again, this time choosing her words with the care of someone placing stones in a sacred circle. She used simple, repetitive phrases. "The thorns are strong," she wrote. "The thorns are sharp. They stand in a circle all through the night." She focused on soft sounds, the sibilant whisper of safe and circle, the gentle M in home and warm. The story, which she titled The Nest in the Thorns, became less of a narrative and more of an incantation. It described a small, scared creature finding a bush where the outer branches were fierce guardians, but the inside was a soft, feathered hollow where nothing could reach. It was a fusion, her human creativity, giving voice to the forest's timeless design. This creative act carried a weight far greater than her previous sketches. A drawing was a record, but a story was a tool. Once spoken, it would take root in a child's imagination, and its impact would be real and immediate. If she failed, the boy's fear would remain. If she succeeded, she would be proving that the hidden codes could be translated into genuine comfort. With the final words written, she closed the notebook, its cover cool beneath her palm. There was no more time for doubt. She stood, the folded page holding the story tucked securely into her pocket, and stepped out into the twilight to return to the waiting mother and child. The only light in the small room came from a single candle, its flame casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Elara knelt before the boy, her voice a soft, steady murmur as she began the story of the nest in the thorns. She did not look at the mother, but she could feel the woman's hopeful gaze like a physical pressure, a silent prayer hanging in the air. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. The boy's eyes remained wide, fixed on the shifting shadows, his small hand gripping his mother's with frantic strength. A cold knot of failure tightened in Elara's stomach. What if the forest's language was meant only for her? What if her translation was clumsy and false, unable to cross the bridge into his frightened mind? Then, as she described the fierce, loving thorns weaving their protective circle, she saw a subtle shift. The tension in his small shoulders began to ease. His breathing, which had been quick and shallow, deepened into a slower, more regular rhythm. His grip on his mother's hand relaxed, his fingers going limp with trust. By the time she whispered the final words about the safe, feathered hollow, his eyes were closed, and he had drifted into a calm and natural sleep. The mother's silent tears of relief were a more powerful validation than any applause. Watching the profound peace on the child's face, Elara felt a solemn understanding crystallize within her. This was not a skill to be sold or a secret to be leveraged. It was a sacred trust. In the quiet of that room, she made a silent, unbreakable promise to the woods. She would never force this gift, never package these sleep stories as a commodity. They would only ever be offered freely, as the forest offered them to her. This success cemented her new purpose, a humble translator, standing between the restless human world and the ancient, quiet wisdom of nature. It was a role that demanded absolute integrity. As she slipped out into the night, the fulfillment in her heart was tempered by a new, subtle sensation. She felt the attention of the woods upon her, a quiet, watchful presence from the dark tree line, as if the forest itself was acknowledging the promise she had just made. The next day, A perfect ring of pale mushrooms encircled the base of the ancient oak. It was unnervingly symmetrical, a flawless silver bracelet laid upon the earth by an unseen hand. This was no accident of nature. It felt like a direct response. The forest's quiet way of saying it had heard her promise and was now answering. A shiver, equal parts awe and apprehension, traced her spine. Was this circle a welcome, a gesture of trust, or was it a boundary, a line drawn around a sanctuary she was not meant to enter? Her first impulse was to step inside, to feel the energy of that sacred space. But the memory of the protective wren and the boy's peaceful sleep held her back. Forcing her way in would shatter the delicate trust she had worked so hard to build. Instead, she settled herself at the very edge of the ring, folding her legs and resting her hands in her lap. She would not take what was not offered. She would wait, as she had learned to do, and listen. The forest seemed to hold its breath with her. The usual rustle of leaves was stilled, the air itself thick with a potent silence. This was no longer a one-sided quest. She had proven herself a respectful student, and now the teacher was beginning to engage. The stakes of this new, two-way communication were immense. Every action, every decision, carried more weight than before. A misstep here would not just be a failure to find a story. It could sever the connection entirely. As she sat in that quiet tension, a single, soft feather drifted down from the high branches of the oak. It spiraled gently, a silent leaf of gray and white, coming to rest in the exact center of the mushroom circle. It was an owl's feather, a symbol of wisdom and keen sight in the darkness. The message was unmistakable. The circle was not a barrier, but an invitation to see more clearly, to understand the deeper truths that only reveal themselves when the world is still. The feather was a key, and the circle was the lock. The long, dry stick felt like an extension of her own arm, a cautious bridge across the sacred circle. With painstaking slowness, she used its forked tip to gently nudge the owl feather toward her. As it slid across the moss, she saw that its soft gray edges were not plain. They were delicately fringed with markings so fine, they looked like a scattering of tiny, silver stars, a secret constellation painted on a feather. Holding it in her palm felt like holding a piece of the night sky, cool and impossibly light. A soft breeze stirred the leaves above, and as it touched the feather, a strange thing happened. The veins began to vibrate, producing a faint, almost inaudible hum, a sound so quiet it seemed to exist at the very edge of hearing. The frustration was immediate and sharp. After such a clear sign, the message itself was a ghost of a sound, a tease that challenged the very limits of her ability to listen. Her mind strained, trying to grasp the elusive frequency, but the harder she focused, the more the sound seemed to retreat into the background rustle of the forest. This was a test not of her intellect, but of her patience, a demand for a deeper kind of surrender. Letting out a slow breath, Elara made a decision. She lay down fully on the cool, damp earth, her body stretched along the outer edge of the mushroom ring. She brought the feather close to her ear, so close its soft filaments almost brushed her skin, and then she closed her eyes. By shutting out the world of sight, by eliminating the distraction of her own body, she funneled her entire being into the single act of listening. The gentle pressure of the ground beneath her became an anchor, steadying her. At first, there was only the thrum of her own blood, a loud internal drum. But as she willed herself to relax, to sink into the earth, that sound too began to fade into the background. And then she heard it. The hum was no longer a single, faint note. It was a complex vibration, a resonance that wove itself into the passing breeze. The tiny star-like markings, she realized, were not just for show. They were a finely tuned instrument, and the wind was the musician. As a steady current of air flowed over them, the hum resolved into a clear, simple melody, a lulling sequence of rising and falling tones that felt ancient and deeply comforting. This was the breakthrough. The code had a sonic layer, a music meant not for the ears, but for the soul. The stakes of this discovery were immense. To have found a melody encoded in a feather, and the wind was to unlock a new dimension of the forest's language, one that could bypass the thinking mind and speak directly to the heart. But the gift was fragile. The moment her concentration wavered, the moment a stray thought entered her mind, the melody would fracture back into its separate, almost silent parts. True understanding required not just hearing, but a state of absolute, unwavering peace. Her own voice rose to meet the wind's quiet song, a soft hum that matched the rising and falling tones as closely as she could. The effort was immense, a delicate balancing act of breath and focus that demanded every ounce of her concentration. Her throat grew tight, her mind strained to hold the precise pitch, terrified that a single wavering note would sever the fragile thread of sound connecting her to the ancient oak. It felt like trying to hold a handful of smoke, the melody threatening to dissolve with the slightest distraction. But then, a subtle shift occurred. Instead of fighting to be a perfect mirror, she let her voice relax, finding a gentle harmony that wove around the forest's melody rather than copying it directly. She added the quiet feeling of safety she had discovered for the boy, the patient resilience of the seed, her own peaceful intention becoming a new thread in the song. In that moment, the wind seemed to lean in. The melody grew slightly louder, clearer, the two sounds intertwining in a true duet. This was no longer a lesson, it was a conversation. The connection was no longer fragile, but strengthened by her unique contribution. She was not just a decoder anymore, she had become a co-creator, a human voice adding its own verse to the forest's eternal lullaby. Then, as gently as it had begun, the shared melody faded, leaving behind a silence that felt deeper and more full than any she had known before. The profound silence that settled after the melody felt heavier and more substantial than any sound. It pressed gently against Elara's ears, a soft, velvet blanket that smothered the last echoes of her own humming. In that deep quiet, a wave of peace washed over her, so unconditional and complete it needed no story, no symbol, no translation. It was a feeling, pure and simple, a warmth that started in her chest and spread outward until even her fingertips felt still. This, she realized with a jolt that was itself peaceful, was the true sleep story. The codes she had worked so hard to decode were not the destination. They were merely the signposts, the gentle instructions that helped a restless mind quiet down enough to finally hear this silent, ever-present music. A cold dread immediately followed the warmth. Her eyes fell upon her open notebook, its pages filled with careful sketches and quiet field notes. If the ultimate goal was this wordless piece, then what value did her entire collection hold? Were her detailed drawings of bark spirals and feather markings just a pointless distraction? a beautiful but empty map to a place that could only be felt, not described. This crisis of purpose was sharp and unsettling. For so long, her identity had been tied to being a translator, a keeper of stories. Now it seemed the greatest story could not be kept at all. She ran her fingers over a charcoal rubbing of the seed's journey. The paper felt rough and real beneath her touch, and in that tactile sensation, the answer surfaced. The notes were not the goal, but they were the essential path. They were the methods, the focused tasks that gave a busy mind something to hold on to, a puzzle to solve that slowly, gently, quieted its internal chatter. The act of tracing a symbol, of matching a hum, of patiently observing a fox, these were not the piece itself, but they were the rituals that cleared the space for peace to enter. Her purpose was not made redundant, it was refined. Her mission was no longer about building a library of sleep stories. It had evolved into something far more profound and challenging. She had to learn how to become a clear vessel for tranquility itself, to embody the quiet she wished to share. This meant her own inner state was now the most important tool she possessed. The stakes were immeasurably higher. To share this deeper understanding, she would have to live it first, carrying the forest's silent song within her long after she had left the trees. The first person she taught was the old man who had found such peace in the story of the seed. She found him one morning, his brow furrowed as he stared at the cold hearth, the calm of the previous night already a fading memory. He asked her for another story, his voice tinged with a familiar desperation. Instead of opening her notebook, Elara gently took his hand and led him outside to a sun-drenched patch of grass beneath a young birch tree. She did not tell him a story. She asked him to listen to one. "Close your eyes," she said softly, "and tell me what the wind is saying to the leaves right above you." His face fell with disappointment. He wanted the magic, the ready-made dream, not a lesson, but he trusted her, and so he tried. This became her new method. She gathered small groups, not to recite her collected tales, but to practice the quiet arts she had learned in the woods. She showed them how to press a palm against the rough bark of a pine and feel for the faint, deep hum of life within. She taught them to match their breathing to the slow, rhythmic rustle of the canopy, inhaling as the leaves stirred and exhaling as they settled. It was slow, patient work, and not everyone had the temperament for it. Some villagers grew visibly frustrated, their shoulders tightening with impatience. They wanted a potion, a spell, a story to passively receive. They saw her techniques as unnecessary steps, a refusal to share the real treasure. "Why must we learn to listen?" they would ask, "when you already know the stories. Just tell us the words that work." In those moments of doubt, Elara would share her own early struggles. She spoke of the day she lost her first sketch to the wind, and the profound frustration of sitting in the silent grove, feeling utterly deaf to the world. She confessed her terror that she was inventing meanings, seeing patterns where none existed. "I was not born with this connection," she would assure them. "I learned it, one failed attempt, one moment of patience at a time. The code is not a thing you can be given. It is a path you learn to walk for yourself." Her vulnerability disarmed their frustration, transforming it from a demand into a shared challenge. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the change took root. A woman who had struggled with the breathing exercises returned one evening with a look of quiet wonder. She had been hanging laundry when she suddenly noticed the way the setting sun lit each individual blade of grass, and for a full minute, her anxious mind had simply stopped its chatter. A man found that by focusing on the sound of rain on his roof, he could drift into a sleep more restful than any story had yet provided. They were finding their own keys to the quiet, their own unique moments of peace that required no translator. Elara's role was shifting from a central wellspring of comfort to a guide who pointed toward the river. This empowerment of the community was the most sustainable gift she could have offered, but it carried a subtle loneliness. The constant, grateful knocks on her door became less frequent. She was no longer the sole keeper of the secret, the mysterious figure who walked with the forest. Yet, as her centrality diminished, a new sign of approval appeared. A deer and her fawn, creatures that had always bolted at the slightest human sound, began to appear at the tree line at dusk, grazing calmly as children played nearby. A family of rabbits would nibble clover in the meadow as villagers practiced their listening. The forest was not retreating from the village's newfound quiet. It was gently, gracefully, extending its borders to meet them. The deer no longer fled at the sound of a closing door. They grazed at the forest's edge at twilight, their soft brown forms a peaceful extension of the village green. Children pointed with quiet excitement, not with shouts, but with whispered awe, learning a new language of respect. Birds nested in the gables of cottages, their morning songs weaving seamlessly with the sounds of human life. It was as if the forest, sensing the community's newfound quiet, had taken a tentative step forward to close the final gap. The very air seemed softer, the boundaries between the tame and the wild blurring into a gentle, living harmony. This reciprocity was the ultimate expression of the decoded piece, a quiet symphony performed by all, yet not every heart was at ease. A handful of the village elders watched this new intimacy with deep-seated worry. They gathered near the well, their voices low and serious. "You are teaching the children that the wild is a gentle friend," one of them said to Elara, his eyes clouded with memory. "But a bear does not care for your quiet breathing. A storm does not ask for your permission. You invite familiarity, and familiarity breeds carelessness." Their fear was not of malice, but of consequence, a protective instinct honed by generations of living alongside an unpredictable force. Elara listened to their warnings with respect, understanding that their caution was a form of care. Instead of arguing, she offered an invitation. She began organizing short, guided walks just after dawn, calling them listening walks. She invited the most skeptical to join her, not to chase stories, but simply to observe. They would walk in silence for a few minutes, then stop, and she would ask a simple question. "What do you hear beneath the bird's song? Can you feel the difference in the air near the stream?" It was not a lesson, but a shared experience, a safe context in which to witness the forest's true nature. The true measure of this integration was seen in the children. They no longer saw the woods as a place for conquest or noisy games. They treated it with a reverence that was both playful and profound. A little girl might spend an entire afternoon patiently building a small circle of stones by a creek, not as a fort, but as a quiet offering. A group of boys learned to identify animal tracks, not to hunt, but to understand who had passed through and when. They were internalizing the code, not as a set of rules, but as a natural way of being. The stakes of this living harmony could not be higher. It was a fragile, beautiful experiment, proving that the peace found in sleep stories could ripple outward and reshape an entire community's relationship with the world. But it remained a delicate balance, a dance between trust and vigilance. Any shift, any moment of thoughtless intrusion could cause the deer to retreat and the birds to fall silent, severing the hard-won connection. The ultimate test was whether this newfound peace could be sustained, becoming not just a practice, but the permanent character of the place. Their small hands, warm and trusting, rested against the ancient oak's rough bark. Elara knelt beside the children, her heart a fragile vessel of hope and fear. They had come to her with eyes full of unclouded wonder, asking not for a story, but for the secret of hearing the trees speak. The purity of their request was both beautiful and terrifying. She worried that their eager minds, so open to magic, might also be quick to feel the sting of disappointment. What if the forest remained silent for them? What if her gentle guidance led only to a quiet anticlimax, dimming the very light she wished to nurture? So she did not speak of codes or languages. She framed it as the simplest game. "Close your eyes," she whispered, her voice as soft as the breeze. "Do not try to hear with your ears. Just pretend you can feel what the tree is feeling. Is it sleepy in the afternoon sun? Is it happy from the morning rain? There is no right or wrong answer. Just feel." She watched their small faces, their eyelids squeezed shut in fierce concentration. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant call of a bird. The tension was a thin thread pulled taut within her. Then, a small girl with a ribbon in her hair gasped, her eyes flying open. "My hand feels buzzy," she announced, her voice filled with astonished delight. "Like the tree is humming a happy song, just for me," the other children murmured in agreement, their own hands still pressed firmly against the trunk, feeling for the first time the subtle, living vibration they had always walked past. In that moment, Elara saw the future of the knowledge, not as a heavy responsibility to be guarded, but as a natural inheritance carried forward on a tide of innocent curiosity. This new generation would learn the language not through struggle, but through play, ensuring its survival with a reverence that was as instinctive as breathing. The laughter of the children became part of the wood song, a new melody woven into the rustle of leaves. Elara watched from a distance as the small group made their own way to the ancient oak, their steps sure and their voices hushed with purpose. They did not need her guidance to begin. They simply settled against its massive roots, their small backs resting against the bark, as if leaning on a patient, old friend. They did not wait for a story to be given. Instead, they began to offer their own, speaking in soft murmurs about the cloud that looked like a sheep, or the ladybug that had landed on a blade of grass. They were not decoding anymore, they were conversing. A bittersweet ache bloomed in Elara's chest, a mixture of profound pride and a quiet, personal sense of loss. This was the fulfillment of everything she had worked for, the knowledge passing from her hands into the hearts of a new generation, where it would grow and change in ways she could never dictate. Yet it meant her central role, the identity of the translator who walked between two worlds, was gently fading. She was no longer the sole bridge. The children were building their own. She made the conscious decision to step back, to fold her hands and remain in the dappled shadows of a younger birch tree. To intervene now would be to impose her own understanding on their pure, unfiltered connection. They needed to learn the language in their own way, to have their own moments of frustration and their own flashes of discovery. Her greatest gift to them was the space to do so. This completed the cycle in the most beautiful way possible. The hidden codes were never meant to be a secret hoarded by one person. Their true purpose was to foster a relationship so natural that listening and sharing became a continuous, breathing exchange, as effortless as the wind moving through the branches. The forest was no longer just speaking to the village. The village was now whispering back, adding its own gentle verses to an ancient and endless story. The final page of her notebook felt soft beneath her fingers, the paper worn from countless mornings and quiet nights. Elara sat in her cottage, the morning light spilling across the table as she added one last entry. She did not sketch a symbol or record a melody. Instead, she wrote about the process itself, the delicate dance of giving attention and receiving understanding that had transformed her village. Her notes described the children's laughter blending with the wind, the respectful silence of the elders on their listening walks, the way the deer now paused at the forest's edge without fear. The book was no longer a decoder's manual. It was a chronicle of a living piece, a testament to a community that had learned to whisper back to the woods. A deep conflict settled in her heart as she closed the cover. To leave this book for others felt like a beautiful gift, a map that could guide future generations. But a map could also become a cage. Written rules could harden into dogma, and the intuitive, personal spirit of the practice might be lost, replaced by a rigid set of instructions that demanded the right answer instead of a quiet heart. The very act of writing it down risked killing the delicate magic she had worked so hard to nurture. Her decision came with a quiet certainty. She would not leave the book on a shelf to be studied. She found a sturdy glass jar with a tight sealing lid, and she carefully placed the notebook inside, a single, smooth river stone resting on its cover to weight it down. As dusk painted the sky in hues of violet and gold, she walked to the ancient oak. With her bare hands, she dug a small, deep hole between its great roots, a sacred vault in the earth. Lowering the jar into the ground felt like returning a precious seed to the soil from which it had grown. She was not hiding the knowledge, she was giving it back to its source, entrusting it to the forest's own keeping. It would be there, preserved, for someone to find only if they were truly meant to, if their heart was ready to listen rather than simply follow. This final act was the ultimate protection of the magic. It ensured the knowledge would not be corrupted by ownership or turned into a cold artifact. It would remain alive, organic, waiting for a moment of genuine need, not casual curiosity. As she patted the last of the dark soil into place, a gentle breeze stirred the oak's highest branches. The leaves rustled with a sound that was not random, but a soft, sighing breath of approval, a final whisper of gratitude for the guardian who had learned to let go. The moon was a perfect, luminous pearl in the ink-black sky, its light so bright it cast sharp, silver shadows across the mushroom grove. Elara stood in the center of the glowing circle, but tonight she carried no notebook, no charcoal, no quartz lens. Her hands were empty, her arms open at her sides as if to embrace the entire, silent forest. She was not there to receive or to decode. She had come only to offer a simple, wordless thank you for the quiet that had settled over her village, for the children's laughter, for the deer at the edge of the green. The air was utterly still, the wind holding its breath. The stream's gentle babble seemed to pause mid-note. Even the owls were silent in the branches above. Every element of the woods was present and waiting. Then, without a sound, the mushroom light intensified, swelling from a soft glow into a brilliant blue-white radiance that illuminated the entire clearing. It was not a light that hurt the eyes, but one that seemed to pour directly into the heart. The understanding that flowed into her was not a story with a beginning and an end. It was a single, overwhelming truth, as clear and undeniable as the moon itself. The spirals in the bark, the melodies in the feather, the patterns in the soil, they were not the secret. They were merely the alphabet, the true hidden code, the one the forest had guarded for centuries, was the simple, profound possibility of harmony. It was the innate capacity for different beings, human, animal, tree, and wind, to listen to one another and find a way to exist in peace. Her years of work, her moments of doubt and discovery, had not been about uncovering a mystery, but about helping her community remember a language they had simply forgotten how to hear. The brilliant light began to gently fade, and the forest's ordinary night sounds returned, one by one, but something fundamental had shifted within Elara. The need to seek was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty. The greatest sleep story was not something to be told. It was the quiet rhythm of a world living in balance, a lullaby that would now continue, generation after generation, with or without a translator. you.